Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 706. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about caves and badlands and bison, missiles and the Missouri, and presidents as we go to the national parks of South Dakota. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about South Dakota. I'd like to welcome back to the show Gary Arndt from everything-everywhere.com, who's come to talk to us, surprise, surprise, about national parks, this time about the national parks of South Dakota. Gary, welcome back to the show. It has been so long.
Yeah, and we never get to talk, so it's always a pleasure.
It has been a very short period of time since I talked to Gary, but we have talked about doing this show since we ran into each other probably at Mount Rushmore last October, September,
I think. Yeah, maybe it was October. But yeah, we were going to T-Bex, and this was totally unplanned. We just happened to be at Mount Rushmore at the exact same time. It's one of those odd coincidences that happen.
And it doesn't happen to me all that often. But there are some national parks in South Dakota that are not Mount Rushmore as well. So where are we going if we go to the national parks of South Dakota?
There's 6 National Park Service sites in South Dakota, and 5 of them are in the west, located in or near the Black Hills. And then there's one all by its lonesome in the east. So we might as well talk about that one first. And that is the Missouri River National Recreation Area. Mm-hmm. It lies on the Missouri River, as you might guess, given the name. It is in the charming little town of Yankton, South Dakota. Believe it or not, I was actually rather curious to visit Yankton because I had read a list several years ago that had the cheapest place to live in America was Yankton, South Dakota. So I was kind of curious to see, I was kind of curious, like, what kind of community is this? And it's very nice, and it's not run down or anything. That's not why it's cheap. It just happens to be in the middle of nowhere, and that's why. The site is right on the border with Nebraska, mm-hmm. And it's a 59-mile stretch of the Missouri River. Very nice, some very large bluffs that are overlooking the river. And it's a national recreation area, so it's not a park. If you go to the visitor center and look to get your national park stamp, it is not a visitor center per se. It is the office. So that's where the maintenance vehicles and the office staff, They're all there. And in that building, there's a very small lobby, and they just sort of stick the stamp out there for people that want it. But unlike pretty much every other national park site you go to, there's no movie, there's no displays, none of that. It's very straightforward. It's just something that you can visit. There's a bridge which goes from South Dakota to Nebraska that crosses the river. Mm-hmm. And that's probably some of the best views you're going to get of the river if you want to take some photos. There's a place you can pull out just before the bridge. You can't really stop on the bridge, nor can you really walk across the bridge. So that's kind of difficult. So you just have to sort of keep those things in mind. It's far enough east where I think you could easily do a day trip if you happen to be in Sioux Falls. Or if you're driving across the state, I mean, if you wanted to dip down, Interstate 90 is the interstate that kind of runs across South Dakota east to west.
Right.
You could do that if you're a serious
Collector of national parks. Yes.
Yeah. Other than that, there's not a lot there.
Well, and I should say for the listeners of the show who are either not from the U.S. or possibly geographically challenged, the Missouri River may not stick out in your mind, but Missouri River is the longest river in North America.
If you include because it merges into the Mississippi River in St. Louis.
Even if you don't include the Mississippi part, I believe.
No, I think it's the Mississippi/Missouri. So if you went from New Orleans and then just kind of banked left at St. Louis rather than right, that would take you further because the Mississippi goes up into northern Minnesota, whereas the Missouri goes much further.
Well, I'm looking it up, and the Missouri River, just until it gets to the mouth where it enters into the Mississippi, is, well, for our European listeners who I was mentioning this for, is 3,767 kilometers or 2,341 miles. So there's really quite an amazing amount of the length of this river, not to mention the fact that it empties into the Mississippi River.
The river at this point in Yankton is pretty good sized.
Yeah.
It's not a rapid river or anything like that. It's far too big for it. If anything else, it kind of gives you an appreciation for the river. I think if you go up to North Dakota, there are some sites that are close to the river as well, and they deal with Lewis and Clark and how they use the Missouri kind of as their highway to get to the west.
Absolutely.
But speaking of the river, I've been in South Dakota many times because I live in Minnesota, and I think of South Dakota as kind of there's two halves to the state, the east and the west, and the dividing line is the Missouri River. So it kind of goes along Nebraska and then it hooks up. And when you're on Interstate 90 that goes east-west, when you cross the river, the geography changes pretty dramatically. So on the eastern side of the river, it's really flat. It is your stereotypical Great Plains, corn for miles. Once you cross it, then you start to see hills instantly. And that's a function of the river. The meandering of the river and the floodplain and everything has basically scoured out everything to the east of it. And literally when you cross the bridge, you start to see some hills. And that's not the Black Hills yet, but it's kind of building up to that. I think you're still well over 100 miles away at that point. And all of the rest of the parks are in this western part of the state. And the western part of the state is by far the most interesting. It gets the most tourists. You've heard of pretty much anything in South Dakota. It is to the west of the Missouri River in that Black Hills area. So we're talking Deadwood, Mount Rushmore, Wall Drug, everything except the Mitchell Corn Palace.
Okay. And I have not been to the Mitchell Corn Palace.
It's probably worth a mention. Again, if you're on the interstate, you can turn off in the city of Mitchell, South Dakota, and it is a dance hall. It's been around, I want to say, since the 1930s. The exterior of the building is covered in corn. And every year they put up new mosaics of corn cobs on the building. And that's their thing. And today I think it's just a museum, and I think they actually may have moved the city hall offices inside. But Lawrence Welk got his start at the Corn Palace.
I did not know that. And I grew up in a house where Lawrence Welk was on every Saturday night, whether I wanted it on or not. So,
he's from South Dakota, and that's where he got his start as a band leader, was at the Mitchell Corn Palace. Nothing to do with national parks, but just a little bit of another bit of South Dakota trivia. Its nickname is the Sunshine State.
What?
Yep. We have there are two states that have the exact same nickname, South Dakota and Florida. I think Florida probably earns it a little bit more, but
I suspect that South Dakota appreciates the sunshine a lot more, though.
So anyways, let's go west across it. And there are two sites before you get to the Black Hills that are both in the Park Service.
And by the way, the Corn Palace was built in 1892.
Oh, that's way earlier than I thought.
Yeah, I was surprised.
I think its claim to fame, though, was as a dance hall during that period of time and from the pre-war period, World War II. So we're across the river now, not quite to the Black Hills. We're kind of outside the city of Wall, South Dakota, which is famous for Wall Drug, which is the world's largest drugstore. And the only reason that's famous is because they don't do it as much anymore. But I remember when I was a kid, we did a trip out there, and I want to say 1978, 79.
Right.
And they have signs for Wall Drug everywhere. in every direction, in every road, and they started putting them around the world. There was one in Amsterdam, hundreds and hundreds of miles before you even got close. They would say, "Have you dug? Well drug," and it's a cheesy tourist attraction
that gets a lot of tourists.
Yeah, if you're going to drive
Surprising
through,
lot
you
of
might as well
tourists.
go there. I had breakfast there the day I was leaving, and they actually have an international program where they bring in kids from all over the world, and they have like a dormitory, and they work at Wall Drug. So a lot of stuff going on. But so the newest Park Service site is the Minuteman Missile National Historic Site. So this is a former Titan missile silo.
Isn't it a Minuteman missile silo?
Duh, you're right. And when we signed the treaty with the Russians at the time, not the Soviets, to dismantle a lot of these silos, they specifically put in a clause that allowed them to preserve a very small number of these as a museum. And I think the Russians also preserved the same right. So there were literally Russian observers who came over to the U.S. and they observed the dismantling of all these silos, but then they kept a couple of these. So this site has 3 different parts. They are all located off the interstate. They're a couple miles from each other, so you're going to want to do it by car, but it's really worth visiting. I was going to visit this site several years ago when I drove through because it's right outside of where Badlands National Park is.
Right.
At the time, the visitor center consisted of nothing but a trailer, and there was very little to see. Now there's a proper visitor center.
Yeah, a very nice museum in there about the Cold War.
Oh, did you get there?
I got to that part, but that's the sad part is that there are 3 parts, as you said, and the other 2 take more planning. And we did not do the planning properly.
Well, one of them definitely does. The other 2 parts are the Delta One tour. And this is in a very,
Nondescript.
it looks like a house, like a ranch style house in the middle of nowhere, except underneath it is a bunker.
Yes.
And so if you've ever seen the movies where the Air Force guys are manning the nuclear missiles and they each have a key and they have to turn it at the same time, that's exactly what this was. And the guy who did the tour for us was a former missile guy who actually worked at this site. And he's a park ranger now. And you get to take the elevator. It's not that far underground, actually. And it's basically in what I would call a very large septic tank that is designed for people to live in. And they would have several days in a row, I would think they would spend down there, and then they would get time off above. And there's bunks and dormitories up above with a dining hall up above. I want to say that one site would manage like 24 different silos located in the area, all connected to this place by some sort of cable. To get a tour of this place requires advanced planning because I think they can only take 6 to 8 people down there at once, just given the size of it. When I had my tour scheduled, I screwed up the time zones because it's in the Western time zone.
Yep.
I don't know. I screwed it up. So I had to drive very fast to get there, very fast. And I made it just in time. There's a parking lot like across the road. It's not hard to find. It's pretty well located on the maps and with signs. But I had to kind of run to the gates, and the fence surrounding the facility and everything else is still intact. They've pretty much left it. This was decommissioned in the early 90s, so it's not that old. And they've left all the furniture and everything inside. They have period magazines from like the 1980s, 1970s and stuff that are in there. And it's really interesting. And I mean, it's one of those things that I'm kind of glad they chose to preserve it because it's the only National Park Service site I can think of that has anything to do with the Cold War.
I am not coming up with any other ones, so you've got me at least for now.
So if you're going to visit this, and I highly recommend you do it, make sure to plan your visit and to reserve a place on your tour several weeks beforehand at least.
Right.
And maybe even longer than that, because they do fill up quickly because the tour groups are so small. And that's really the limiting factor. It's the highlight of the entire park experience. So if you're going to go all that way, I would definitely do that. And you can easily tie it into a trip to Badlands National Park or the Blacklands.
Yeah, basically the visitor center of that and the visitor center of Badlands National Park are 10 miles apart, 5 miles apart. I mean, they're very close.
Yeah, you have the visitor center, you have the Delta O1 site, which is that, and then the Delta O9 site, which is an actual silo.
Mm-hmm.
And that you don't need a registration for. They do ranger tours. When I was there, I believe it was on Saturdays that they did it. So you'll want to check the schedule. I think that might be seasonal. In the summer, they probably do more tours, but you don't have to have a tour. They have like an audio tour you can do through cell phone at the site where you can just call up a number or an app and just kind of get an audio tour of things. And you can look down the silo. There's not a lot to see because it's basically just this concrete silo thing in the middle of nowhere.
And they don't let you fire a missile or anything like that.
No, it's a glass top now. That wasn't the case
Right.
during the Cold War. But you can see how it would flip up. And these things could all be launched within minutes, quite literally. Right. Very, very quickly.
Which was the idea of the Minuteman missile. I mean, harkening back to the Minutemen and who were ready in a minute back in the Revolutionary War. Yeah, the problem we ran into is we didn't do the Delta One tour booking ahead of time just because we weren't planning actually to go out there. We didn't realize how close it was. And then when we decided we were going to go out to Badlands and the visitor center, we just hadn't done it far enough in advance. And the problem with the missile site is when we were there in September, it closed at 3:00. And by the time we'd seen Badlands and had lunch at Waldrug, it was too late. So again, just make your plans accordingly. And by the way, from Minuteman Missile Visitor Center to Badlands National Park is 3.8 miles. So I was even more optimistic or pessimistic than I thought I was.
So next we should probably talk about Badlands.
Yeah.
Consider there. I think Badlands is really the premier quote unquote national park with the national park title. I think it's the kind of the premier site in South Dakota.
I think others would argue for Mount Rushmore, but I think you're right.
Mount Rushmore is better known.
It is better known, yes.
But I would say if you're going to visit one place in South Dakota, it would be Badlands.
I would agree with you. Yeah, it's quite stunning.
The interesting thing about the park is that a lot of so it's a badland, roughly speaking. So there's Badlands in North Dakota, there's Badlands in South Dakota, there's Badlands in Alberta, and it's basically this part of the state that's kind of cut out of the prairie, and it's highly eroded. So you can see exposed stratigraphy, very brightly colored layers. And a lot of those layers actually come from Yellowstone National Park. When they had the various volcanic eruptions in Yellowstone, a lot of it ended up settling in this area, and that's actually what you can see.
Well, when we asked the park rangers, they told us that a lot of the volcanic ash on this, the gray ash there, which is the bentonite, I want to say, but you're the one with the geology degree, they said it was from Great Basin National Park in Nevada. I thought it was from Yellowstone, and they corrected me. So I'll give you that for what it's worth.
I don't think Great Basin is volcanic.
I don't know.
That's a whole different structure. I don't think there's volcanoes there. Yeah, because we've stopped there on a geology field trip back when I was studying geology at the University of Minnesota. And Yellowstone was what we were told, and Yellowstone makes the most sense.
Yellowstone was what I expected the answer to be. So maybe it's just something they use to punk the travel bloggers who come.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Yellowstone unless someone listening to this wants to chime in something different, because I don't think Great Basin is volcanic. I don't recall that being the case at all. The whole Great Basin area was formed in a completely different way. But that's neither here nor there.
No, it's in Nevada, right?
Yeah. The whole park can pretty much, I would say it's mainly one road that will take you through the park from one entrance to the other. And within that, there's lots of places you can stop, lots of places you can hike. There is another kind of lesser developed road that can take you off of that, but it's not nearly as popular. And it's a really beautiful and kind of different part of the state. And it's one of the few parks, and we're going to talk about one of the other ones later, that actually preserves prairie land. The sexiest part of the park is what I mentioned. It's the kind of eroded hills where you can see the different colors, the oranges, the reds, and the yellows in the rock, the different layers. But then there's also a big chunk of the park once you kind of turn the other way, and you'll see it's prairie land. And we don't have a lot of national parks in the U.S. that preserve prairie, oddly enough. And that's the case in Canada as well. And this is one of the few. And the prairie isn't really even the highlight of it. So that's one of the reasons. I'm very pro-prairie. because we don't
Okay.
have a lot of it left. And it used to be probably the singular biggest geographic feature in the United States. The Great Plains was this enormous sea of grass,
Right.
and we've pretty much plowed under all of it. So having some places that are original prairie where you can see, I think there's pronghorn actually in this part of the state, in addition to mule deer and other things. I'm trying to think if there was a prairie dog colony in Badlands. I want to say there is.
I don't remember seeing any, but it sure looks like there should be.
Yeah, it's definitely in that area. But yeah, Badlands is great. And again, you're going to probably want to. Rapid City is sort of the largest city in western South Dakota. It's located between this area with Badlands and Minuteman Missile and the Black Hills. So if you're looking for a base that you can work out of, Rapid City would work. There's hotels in Wall where you can stay that are all pretty cheap, or Black Hills itself. You could actually drive to Badlands easily on a day trip from the Black Hills as well. It's pretty close.
Yeah, that's what we did. It's an hour or something like that, I want to say.
It might actually be a little, depending on where you are in the Black Hills.
Right, true.
Because it can be challenging to drive around the Black Hills because they're hills.
Oddly enough.
Yeah, so if you're kind of further in the north, like Spearfish or something, it may take a little longer, or like Deadwood. But yeah, either way, it's still doable on a trip. Let's go now to the obvious one, which is Mount Rushmore National Memorial. I really don't know what to say about it because it's Mount Rushmore. There are 4 faces carved into rock. You've all seen the photo. You go there, you look at it, and a lot of the narrative at the visitor center and everything else is really around the building of Mount Rushmore. The story of what's his name, Borglund, who was the builder, how he did it, the process. I want to say the last guy who helped build Mount Rushmore just died like a week or two ago.
He was there signing books the day that you and I were there. And he was one of the people who was up with the jackhammers helping carve it. And since we were there in September, and now when we're recording in April, he died. You are correct. So yeah, members of our group talked to him and chatted with him about the experience.
Now, when it was built, supposedly, the plan was actually to create a building or a room or a vault of some sort behind the heads of the presidents. And the intent was to actually move part of the National Archive to Mount Rushmore, or at least that was his plan. I don't think he had the government on board with this. So supposedly behind, I want to say, like Washington's head, there actually is the beginnings of a hallway that kind of go to an empty room. If you've ever been to Petra, you know how when you go in the treasury, there's just nothing there. It's just an empty room.
It's not as deep as it was in the movie.
Yeah, same as this. I would actually like to go up there sometime. From what I've told, you actually can get to the top of the mountain and get behind it. And I'm sure you've seen like the joke T-shirts that have pictures of the backside of Mount Rushmore, and it's 4 naked guys with their heads.
I have indeed.
If we're going to talk about Mount Rushmore, we might as well talk about one other site that's in the area but is not a national park.
Before you go there, some things that I learned from this was my first trip to Mount Rushmore this year. And I did not realize that the original intention was to carve the torsos of the presidents as well. And you can see, if you look at it, that Washington has his coat lapels carved out of the rock. The other presidents don't, but basically the whole thing was over budget and much later than planned, and so they did not finish that. They decided at some point it is done. This is as done as it's going to be, and there's never going to be another president carved on it, just in case you were wondering. The other thing that I did not know is that Lincoln, they had to blow him off the mountain because there was a problem when they went to carve him the first time, and he was on the other side of Washington. And it went dramatically wrong. I think a crack developed is what my understanding is, and they had to dynamite off what they had carved away and start him again in the spot that he is now, which both of those were news to me.
Yeah, I've definitely seen the original model of what it was supposed to look like, where Washington, it would have basically had him down to his waist with his hands, actually, one of his arms. And I think Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt, they're kind of recessed a little bit more. Right. They wouldn't have had as much. But Lincoln, the original plan was to have one of his arms like almost up to his chin, like he's stroking his beard a little bit. Would have been kind of cool if they did it, but they didn't.
And while we are at a break, I'm looking at the National Park website, and it says that the volcanic ash in Badlands comes from eruptions in the Great Basin, not from Great Basin National Park, as I said, but from the Great Basin. And there are lava beds in the Great Basin, but I don't believe, not in the National Park area. So
that would make sense.
They at least are sticking to their story. You started to say there is another large statue in South Dakota that is not a national park site.
There is, and that is the Crazy Horse statue, or I don't even know if you can call it a statue because it's a whole mountain. That is still being worked on to this day. It was started back in, I want to say, the 1940s, I think, and it was basically a local tribe. They wanted to have their own mountain sculpture to remind people that they have their heroes too. They picked Chief Crazy Horse, who was actually killed in a fort in Nebraska. He turned himself into surrender, and then one of the guys in the fort killed him. There were no photos ever taken of Crazy Horse, but when the process started, there were still people alive that had met Crazy Horse, and they were brought in, and they had a sketch artist draw a sketch of Crazy Horse based on these people's recollection of him. So that's kind of why it looks how it does.
Well, and there's some controversy whether there's no photos taken of him. If you go to the Custer Trading Post just outside Custer National Park in Montana and you ask, they will show you a tintype that is reputed to be Crazy Horse, and they will tell you the whole history of how this may or may not be Crazy Horse, the different controversy involved. But it's reasonably believable, the story that I've heard, and I've read that as well.
That's not what they're going to tell you at the Crazy Horse Memorial.
That is correct.
The face is done, and I think they basically had to prioritize, what were they going to put their efforts into. So they did kind of the face first, which kind of makes sense. So you can at least see that there's something there, and it's not just a blob of rock. His outstretched arm is mostly done, or at least the top of it. And what they're focusing on now is removing the rock to start doing he's going to be astride a horse. So the head of the horse is where the top of his outstretched arm will be. And this will end up being significantly larger than Mount Rushmore. I think it already is.
And you say he's going to be on top of a horse. I get the impression that is, but not in my lifetime.
It might be. So when I was there, I actually got to meet the person who's the head of PR, who's the daughter of the guy who was the sculpture, and his kids are doing it today. I should add, the reason why this is still being sculpted today is because they have a foundation and they have a visitor center and a gift shop and a restaurant and everything else. And that is pretty much what is funding this to keep it going.
Right.
Whereas if it's a Park Service site, I don't think they could do that. They only can do this because it's private. There are tours you can take. So there's one that's like a bus tour, and you get in a bus at the visitor center and they will basically take you to the base of the mountain, and you kind of just loop around and you get out and you can take some pictures kind of from the other side. And that's the other thing, whereas Mount Rushmore is designed only to be viewed from one direction.
Right.
This is going to be a 360 sculpture. And there's also a poem that will be sculpted into it. So they're going to sculpt what looks like a scroll, and that'll be kind of, so if you're looking at the normal where he's facing to the right, it will be to his left. That I think is going to be the last thing that they do. Strangely enough, will probably be the easiest part of the sculpture as well. But it will be designed to be viewed from 360 degrees. So it's not just something you would view from the visitor center. I believe there is 2 times a year where you can actually go up it and stand near the head. And there's 1 time a year, and I was a week away from visiting it, where they actually have pyrotechnics and stuff where they light up torches and whatnot on the statue itself. So I think that was in September. I think you're going to obviously want to check the website. They have a light show, a laser light show, where they actually illuminate the full body and the horse's head. So what it will look like on the actual sculpture the way it is today. So if you're there at night, there's something to see. But yeah, I don't think it's ever going to be a National Park Service site. They've created an institute, a summer institute for Native Americans to come and learn, and they can apprentice and work at the site. So there's a lot of things going on just beyond the sculpture itself. There's a museum there. They will usually have Native American dancing and other cultural events going on most days. Oh, and September 6th, that'll be the date for 2020 when we're recording this. And it's the night where they kind of light up the sculpture.
And we should prepare you that one's going to be a little more expensive than visiting Mount Rushmore.
Yes. I'm trying to think, did Mount Rushmore even cost anything beyond parking?
You had to pay for parking, yeah, which was $10 for parking or something like that. And you can't use your national park pass for the parking.
Correct. And I think that's why they do it that way. Mm-hmm. You can enter for free, quote unquote, but you end up paying for parking. The Crazy Horse is, I don't know, for whatever reason, we have two, well, I suppose three if you include Stone Mountain in Georgia. But there's only a couple massive mountain-sized sculptures in the United States, very few in the world, and the two just happen to be a couple miles from each other. So we got two more left, and they're very similar.
Before we get to those, actually, my understanding of there's a reason why those two are so close to each other is the whole Black Hills was sacred site for the Native Americans who lived there, and there was a great intention to keep out settlers, and there were trees that would keep settlers out of the region. And so when Mount Rushmore was carved, there was some backlash from the Native American community that at least if you're going to carve something in these sacred mountains, which you shouldn't do, it should be a Native American. I think that's what started the other project.
Yeah, although there's been some controversy about the Crazy Horse sculpture, but yeah, it originally was a Native American idea, and they're the ones that started. And you can hear the story of it. And once you're there, they have a theater that, as you would expect at a visitor center, shows that kind of stuff.
Right.
So the next two sites are both caves. And one is Wind Cave National Park, and the other is Jewel Cave National Monument. Mm-hmm. Now, there are geologists who believe that they are all part of one cave system. They have yet to prove it, but they keep finding new corridors and new caves, and they're close enough together where they think that at some point, in some small way, they may hook up. But that hasn't been proven yet. So we'll start with Wind Cave. Wind Cave is actually one of the oldest national parks in the U.S.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it is. A lot of people don't realize that. Like many caves, it was discovered by accident. That's where the name comes from. There were some ranchers who found this very windy, noisy hole coming out of the ground, and they went and explored it with some ropes and ladders and candles, and it kept going and going, and eventually it became a tourist attraction, and then eventually it became a national monument and a national park. And the thing that it's probably best known for, and so there's different cave sites in the national park system. There's Wind and Jewel Cave. There's obviously Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, Carlsbad Cavern, Oregon Caves in Oregon, and Great Basin National Park also has a significant cave system as well in the Lehman Caves. The caves are very different. It's easy to say they're like limestone and they were eroded away, which is true. Mammoth Cave, for example, really does not have a lot of very interesting
stalactites and stalagmites.
Features inside.
Quite different.
It's pretty bare, and there's not a lot to. It's an enormous cave system. I think it's
largest in the U.S.
in the world.
Well, there are debates about that.
Well, it depends what you call it, because you can do it by length, you can do it by volume, you can do it by a singular chamber, which I think the largest now is in Vietnam.
Right.
But it's up there. It's a big one. There's a thing called a boxwork lattice, I believe that's the name of it, inside Wind Cave. And it's something that, as far as I know, is not really found anywhere else. And basically, they look like the square mail slots, like you'd stick mail into in a building, except they're on the roof. And a lot of the early visitors to the park would chip off parts of this stuff. And so it's very, very delicate. There's not a lot there. But that is really kind of the unique feature of the cave system. There's different tours you can take, depending on the time of day, the length of the tour, how far in you go, how difficult and strenuous it is. For the most part, there's a common tour that you can kind of take. One of my trips there, I actually I had to pay, I think it was $100, a media fee, so I could bring in a tripod. Because you cannot bring a tripod into Wind Cave, and for good reason. I don't think they want people setting up tripods and people tripping over them. So I was basically by myself for an hour with a ranger. which was kind of a neat experience. And I should add, the exception to that, Carlsbad Cavern in New Mexico, you can bring tripods, which is why it's my favorite cave in the park system. The hidden part of Wind Cave that does not get as much attention is the surface.
Right.
And there's a part of me that thinks they should really rename this park to Black Hills National Park, because it would give the surface a bit more attention. You have bison, you have that rolling, hilly prairie, plus the forested area. It's a real unique ecosystem. And it also abuts Custer State Park, which has a very large bison herd. They'll do bison roundups with cowboys. It's actually really neat if you're able to catch that. And I think Custer is actually one of the better state parks in the United States.
I would go as far as say, you said that Badlands was your favorite national park in the state, and I agreed with that. I would say Custer State Park is my favorite park in the state.
There's a good argument for that. I think it would be great if they were to merge Custer and Wind Cave into one park, because they do border each other. Right. And it's easy to drive from one to the other, and create one very large park. And like I said, rename it Black Hills National Park. I think it would make for a really great park. And even then, I think the primary draw wouldn't be the cave. The cave's very cool, but there's so much more on the surface. So don't just go to the visitor center, get your stamp, do a cave tour, take some time, drive around. There is definitely a prairie dog colony in Wind Cave National Park.
Absolutely. Yeah, we did the hike on the Cold Brook Canyon Trail and walked through a prairie dog colony, and then we also did the hike up to the Forest Fire Lookout Station up in the northern part of the park, and I don't remember what the name of that trail is, but both those great hikes. But yeah, the first one we definitely hiked right through a prairie dog colony.
I know there's one small dirt road that's off the main road that goes through the park where you can pull over, and I spent the better part of an hour just photographing prairie dogs, which is one of my favorite things to do, especially with a really good lens. As with all caves in the park system, they're going to be concerned about white nose syndrome, which I think is a fungus that can kill bats. So if you've been in any other caves or anything like that, make sure to not wear the clothes that were in that cave. They'll have some stuff for you to sanitize the bottom of your shoes before you go in. Just be aware of that. And other than that, it's I think one of the highlights of the Black Hills. It's one of those things where when you're in Paris, you go to the Eiffel Tower. When you're in the Black Hills, you go to Mount Rushmore. But that doesn't mean it's the best thing there. And I really think Wind Cave National Park, along with Custer State Park, really is the highlight of the Black Hills.
Well, and you mentioned how close Wind Cave and Jewel Cave are to each other. I think they're 31 miles apart, so that you really want to visit them on the same day, but you are going to have that issue of the white nose bat syndrome, and I don't remember the name of it, that you will have some problems if you do try and visit them in the same day.
Yeah, you might want to go to the website and see how they deal with that. It may just be wearing a different pair of shoes.
Yeah, I think that was
more than anything else.
Yep.
And I should also add, there is one massive point of failure for all these caves.
Yes, there is.
And it is the elevator. So when I was there in September of 2019, the elevator in both of the sites was not working.
Right. And wasn't going to be working for months.
Yeah. So we're recording this in April 2020. Well, I don't know if they're fixed because it doesn't matter at this point because everything's closed. But I want to say they're fixed at this point. And if they're not, this is an excellent time for the park to be shut down for them to fix it. I went to their website before the interview to check to get an update. And there was nothing about the elevators not working. So I think they're fixed.
Yeah, they were supposed to be fixed by spring, so that would make sense. Yeah,
Right.
That was the only time I have been to Wind Cave National Park, and we skipped Jewel Cave National Park because we couldn't go down into either one. But as you say, we did enjoy Wind Cave National Park quite a lot, even though we didn't go into the cave. We did do the ranger walk to the original opening of the cave where the wind comes out of, but that was about it.
Yeah, and then the last one is Jewel Cave, which actually, again, has actually been a national monument for quite some time. The cave itself is going to be kind of similar. So my first trip to Jewel Cave was in the trip I mentioned in the late 1970s with my family, and we actually got to go into the cave. And the thing that still sticks out to me to this day is the tour we were on, the ranger, you had to walk up a flight of stairs, And as we walked to the top of these stairs, the ranger said, now we're at the deepest part of the cave that we're going to be on in this tour. And the deepest part was at the top of the stairs because it happened to be under a hill. And when you're a kid, I thought that was just really interesting. There is stuff at the surface of Jewel Cave as well. And so I kind of explored a bit more of that than I probably otherwise normally would have on my last trip because the elevator was closed. So there's a brand new-ish visitor center. By newish, I mean probably a couple decades. And typical visitor center stuff, you can see the movie, all the interpretive center. But then if you go a few miles down the road, they have the old visitor center. And this was the original one that was built and the original entrance to the cave. And they do a candlelight tour. These tours actually were still ongoing. So I could have done this tour. I just didn't have enough time because it doesn't rely on an elevator. It is literally a log cabin where the ranger for the park, this was, I want to say, pre-World War II, World War II that time, and that's how you enter it. So there is no elevator. So that was still able to be done. And I actually hung out with the group as the ranger gave them the introduction and the explanation of everything before they went down. I didn't have a ticket. So you can do that as well. So there's different tours that they offer. And that area around the old visitor center is still there, and you can go visit it, and you can go inside and check it out. They have a ranger that is stationed there as well.
I wanted to make a case here. I want to go back to Custer State Park for a second and make my case for this being the best park in South Dakota. And I've got 4 arguments for you. One is, you mentioned it, and that's the bison. If you want to see large herds of bison, this is one of the best places in the U.S., not the only place. Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, Yellowstone, where these came from, are definitely places you can also, but this is definitely one of the places where you can have a bison encounter. And by bison encounter, I mean we ran into a bison traffic jam where we were literally, at some point you decide you need to drive on and you're driving slowly in and amidst the bison. So definitely an experience there. 2 would be the Needles Highway, which is one of the most scenic highways in the U.S. Just a little short highway up between Custer State Park and Mount Rushmore. And you're driving through spires of rock on this really windy road, and it is gorgeous. 3 would be Sylvan Lake. I would highly recommend a walk around Sylvan Lake. It is a very easy hike. It is a very beautiful granite reservoir. I think it is not an actual lake, or at least it has been expanded into a reservoir through a dam, but it is a beautiful rock facing thing. If you ever saw the movie National Treasure 2 with Nicolas Cage, this was where they find the entrance to the back part of
Mount Rushmore,
and the city of El Dorado, which isn't really there, but this is where they filmed that. It's gorgeous, gorgeous scenery. And the 4th would be that while you're there, you ought to go eat at the local restaurant there, the Bluebell dining room, which is inside of the park. And sometimes park dining is okay, and sometimes it's really great. This is really great. I'd recommend getting the buffalo stew or the buffalo brisket quesadilla or something like that. It is a very good place. We went back there again because we enjoyed it so much. So Custer State Park, a real treat.
Yeah, I can't argue with you. It's a fantastic park, and I agree with your assessment of the top places to have a bison experience. Custer, Theodore Roosevelt, and Yellowstone are probably the top. I think there are some private ranches where you can probably also see it as well. But as far as like national park sites or public land, those are the top ones that I can think of off the top of my head. There are some in Canada, but in the U.S., those would be my top 3 too.
Well, the one in Canada that comes to mind, I don't know if they still have buffalo there, but my favorite named national park, Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, is a place that you can at least get the history there. Oh, if you are interested in the bison in Custer, go back, and I believe it's in September. We just missed it by a week or 2, the roundup, where Gary mentioned that they have the cowboys come in and they round up all of the bison and take care of them and see to their medical needs and all those things one time a year. And that is apparently a spectacle.
I've actually been there by accident during that.
Excellent.
So I kind of got to see it. And I have some photos as well from it. Some other things to see when you're in the region are the pigtail bridges,
What?
which I don't know if they're unique to the Black Hills, but they're certainly something you're going to probably see more of there than anywhere else.
I don't
and it
know
was
what
a
you're
solution.
talking about.
It's like a corkscrew bridge that they used to get around the problem of how to get you up and down in elevation in certain places. I forget the name of the highway, but there's some of these where you can see Mount Rushmore. And there are actually places, and I have some photos of this on my website, where you can frame Mount Rushmore in a tunnel.
Yes.
And so I have several photos of Mount Rushmore being seen through the tunnel. And I should also add, going back to Mount Rushmore, there's a place where you can go to the side of Mount Rushmore and get like a profile view of George Washington. Right. And there's a place where you can park and turn out for that. And that doesn't cost anything. That's just on the highway.
So one of the places where you can see a pigtail bridge is in Wind Cave, but it's saying that basically the idea of a pigtail bridge came from the former self-taught superintendent of Custer State Park, which surprises me. And there are 3 bridges on the Iron Mountain Road in South Dakota, and I do not know where the Iron Mountain Road is, but it's got to be in this area as well.
I want to say that's the road I was talking about.
I suspect you are correct.
Where you can see, Mount Rushmore through a tunnel.
Yes,
yeah.
That is, in fact, it's the road that I was talking about by the Needles Highway. You're right in the same area. Very cool.
But yeah, this is a great part of the world in the Black Hills. And I think it was always I grew up in the Midwest, so it was kind of a pretty popular destination for people to like go on a camping trip or a road trip to go to South Dakota. And it's the part everybody goes to. And I think it's still the case today. There's some elements of it that are pretty touristy and cheesy, but not as bad as I think it used to be when we went there as a kid.
And when you're talking about touristy and cheesy, you're talking wall drug and maybe bits of Deadwood?
Deadwood's not even that bad. I actually stayed in Deadwood as part of my last trip. And Deadwood's like an actual city. And obviously there's a lot of history in the downtown area where you can go to the saloons and the hotels and everything that are quite historic. And they still offer, I want to say it was one of the first places in the U.S. outside of like Las Vegas or Atlantic City that allowed gambling.
Right.
And they allowed, I think, blackjack and poker or something. And this was quite a while ago, and it was a pretty revolutionary thing at the time.
Well, and if you're there in the summertime, there are players who are reenacting scenes of Wild Bill Hickok getting murdered or Calamity Jane or those sort of things. It can be a fun place, especially for families. But this is the thing that opened up the Black Hills to settlers, even though it was given to, well, you can't give to the Native Americans land that was already theirs. It was by treaty supposed to stay in Native American land, but gold was discovered near Deadwood, and that's what brought in the settlers in an inexorable wave that changed the land forever.
Yeah, gold sort of trumps treaties.
Apparently
that's what history has shown us.
Yeah. Whether it should or not, one could argue, but it definitely has in the past, yeah.
And I should add one other site that's not too far away, and you could probably do it on a day trip, might be a little bit longer day trip, and that's Devil's Tower in Wyoming.
Oh, yeah.
The Black Hills are not that far from Wyoming, and as you go west, a lot of the landscape is very similar to what you're going to find in the Black Hills. That's something that's definitely worth a visit if you're in the area as well.
And it is very conveniently located. Excellent. Are we ready to do some wrap-up questions, Gary?
You're the boss. You're driving, so I'm just the passenger.
If you were standing at the prettiest spot in all of South Dakota in a national park or state park, I'll give you that, where are you standing? What are you looking at?
I think I might be on one of the towers on Wind Cave National Park. So I think there's some towers you can climb. Mm-hmm. Maybe Sylvan Lake, like you mentioned, in Custer State Park.
That is gorgeous.
Or one of the overlooks in Badlands National Park, I think. You know, one of the spots where you can pull up your car and just kind of see the vista.
Right. In Badlands National Park, you don't want to be a big fan of trees.
No, there are no trees.
But if you like geology, for instance, the colors of the rock there, that you got these reds and greens along with yellows and lots of tans, was very interesting.
And I should also add, if you go to Badlands and it's raining, That's not such a bad thing because when the rocks get wet, it tends to bring
More
out the
color.
color a little
Yeah.
bit more.
Yeah, I say lots and lots of tan, and lots and lots of gray. The bentonite, that gray, that area. Excellent. And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in South Dakota.
Have you dug Wall Drug? They give out free ice water. Did you know that? Free ice water for travelers.
That was how they got their start, really, luring the travelers off the road with their free cold ice water.
And 5-cent coffee. And I still think they offer that. That was the price they did in like the 30s and 40s.
I believe you are correct.
And they do that as kind of a marketing gimmick.
Yeah, we ate at Wall Drug. Yeah, schmeh. It was okay. I had many better meals in South Dakota, including the Bluebell Cafe and the Custer State Park. But yes, you can get your cheap coffee there.
The other thing, only in South Dakota or in the Black Hills, if you're a geology fan, it is a fantastic place for collecting minerals and finding minerals that you're really not going to find most other places. Because it's an area of uplift, you have a lot of metamorphic rock that you don't normally find. So some of it's not open to the public. I was able to go when I was on a geology trip. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of road cuts where we saw huge chunks of mica. And mica back in the early 20th century used to be used for the windows in ovens, because you could sort of see inside, but it wouldn't melt or anything because it was actually a mineral. And so, yeah, there's places where you can find enormous sheets of this stuff still, both muscovite and biotite. We saw some rolled garnets and all sorts. And there's actually one place where you can see some of the largest crystals in the world. There are these enormous crystals that are the size of like railroad boxcars.
Oh my gosh.
I think there's a place in Mexico, there's a cave that has gypsum crystals that are bigger than this, but it's one of the largest you're going to find anywhere. I think it's spodumene. And again, that's on private property, so you can't see it. But to give you an idea of some of the interesting geologic stuff you can find. And you're going to find a lot of these gem and rock stores all over the Black Hills. Where you could pull in. And if you're there, I would strongly suggest doing that. Even if you don't want to buy anything, they'll have the geodes and stuff like that everyone's looking for, but they'll have all kinds of stuff. And I remember pulling into one and just talking to the woman that ran it. And I'm not an expert at her level, but I know a little bit more than most people, having studied geology. And it was very interesting talking to her, because a lot of the things that like she was interested in or she found interesting are the things that a lot of people aren't necessarily interested, the visitors that come in.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize the national parks of South Dakota in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln.
All right. Excellent. Our guest again has been Gary Arndt from everything-everywhere.com. I'm hoping you have been watching some of his photos as you listened to this. But if you haven't been, certainly go over to everything-everywhere.com and check them out. We'll have a link to your post on the National Parks of South Dakota in the show notes of this episode, which everyone can see in the lyrics, for one thing, is one way to see those. Gary, thanks so much for coming back on Amateur Traveler. Thanks again to the patrons of the show who are supporting it. And thanks to Chris Kilworth, recent guest on the show talking about Senegal, who increased his pledge this week. And thanks to the patrons who hung out with me on our monthly Zoom call last weekend. I find myself looking forward to those. If you're interested in supporting the show, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. I had a recent review of the show from Mitzi UP. I'm assuming that's Upper Peninsula. I love this podcast. On my flight to Europe last summer, I listened to the podcasts for the different countries we were going to. It was so fun. I also listened to them on the way home to see what I saw and compare. Great podcast. I'm hoping for an episode on the circle tour around Lake Superior. I'm planning to do this in the summer. I also had a review from 20s Struggles, who said, I'm planning a trip to Provence in the fall and have read dozens of blogs and listened to many podcasts. Wendy's insights were very refreshing with truly specific, helpful tips. Her enthusiasm and place was lovely. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate the guidance your podcasts offer. One thing I should say is I sometimes get these reviews, and the reviews are for specific episodes, which is fine. But sometimes I'll get a bad review for the podcast because they didn't like a particular episode. These all show up on the podcast. It is what it is. But just so you know, for any podcast you're reviewing the entire podcast, not just one episode. That's Amateur Traveler and all the other podcasts as well, at least within the Apple ecosystem. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.